very much, Richard. This film is about the evacuation of patients in the event of fire. Now, of course, hospitals and nursing homes are many and varied, so there can be few hard and fast rules. But of one thing you can be sure, it will be several minutes before the fire brigade reaches you. The number of lives lost or saved during that time depends entirely upon you. And we are going to show you how to deal with the situation during those vital minutes. The patients have to be moved to safety, and you have to learn to use whatever may be available. You may have people to help you, or you may not. You may have ward equipment, now beds, even stretcher trolleys, as well as chairs and wheelchairs. All these things and others can be invaluable, provided you know how to use them and when to use them. A recent survey has shown that over 40% of your patients know what to do. Now, quite obviously, you don't panic. Keep a clear head, set a good example, that goes without saying. But would you know the safety will be able to get themselves to safety, and a further 10% will need only slight assistance. Now, quite clearly, these are going to be the first people to reach a place of safety. A nurse can direct fully ambulant patients to the nearest fire exits, but if they already know the right direction to go, you can be better employed elsewhere.
Go on, Rick.
But patients should be encouraged to help one another in time of emergency. Anyone can form a human crutch. It doesn't have to be a nurse. It can be slow and is only practical if there's enough time and help available. But you can't rely on patients getting each other out. Generally speaking, at least one trained helper will be required. Children can be cradled in arms, even two at a time, without much difficulty. But with adults, the method isn't quite so easy. Oh yes, it looks easy at first, but after a long walk with the patient in your arms, it's tiring, to say the least. Only the strongest of helpers will be able to evacuate several patients using this method. It's even more difficult if the patient can't link arms around your neck.
Look up, Jonathan.
The same applies to piggyback. Easy enough with a child, but with an adult it's almost impossible to crouch down in front of the bed and rise with a patient on one's back. So it's a useful lift, but only if the patient is able to help you by standing on a chair or bed. Hand seat drill requires two trained helpers. This is the two-handed seat, which can also be formed like this, which is a firmer hold, but uncomfortable if you wear a ring. With two arms free, a fair degree of support can be given to the patient. The three-handed chair is formed by one helper grasping her own wrist and the wrist of the other helper. With an arm free, the colored nurse here is able to support the patient's back. By using her right hand to form the seat, the left arm can give support to an injured leg, or perhaps even open doors en route to safety. The four-handed seat provides a strong grip for the helpers as their wrists are fully interlocked. The patient, though, must be conscious and able to give some support with the arms. If the patient is unconscious, the fore and aft carry can be used. Ungainly? Yes, but it's simple and not as awkward as it looks. All these lifts are dependent upon the amount of time you have available. Perhaps the golden rule about lifting patients is never risk becoming a casualty yourself. Never attempt something that may be too much for you. Many of the more complicated lifts are designed specially for lifting patients from their beds onto evacuating equipment. But you can't even begin to think about using that equipment for evacuation unless you know how to perform those lifts safely. Safely for you and safely for your patients. These male nurses are learning how to do the Australian lift.
I want you to join arms underneath the patient's thighs, well to the top. Good. Part your legs with the front leg pointing in the way that you're going to move, and your weight on the back leg. Put your shoulders under the patient's axilla. The leading arm can either be placed on the mattress or can take hold of the bed head to act as a lever. On the command go, decide who's going to give the command. I want you to move your weight from the back leg to the front leg in a seesaw action, lifting the patient clear of the bed.
Go.
Good. We're going to use the same lift, slightly modified to get the patient out of bed. It can be used to move the patient from the ward or onto a chair. So if you could come round the other side of the bed, please. You'll take the patient's feet, you'll take the patient's top, swing them gently around so that they're sitting on the edge of the bed. Good. Again, clasp your arms under the patient's thighs. The foot nearest the bed should be pointing towards the bed and have the weight on it. Your back leg should be slightly apart, ready to take the weight. Good. Again, shoulders under the patient's axilla and support the patient's back with your other arm. On the command go, I want you to stand up so that your weight is evenly distributed between your 2 feet.
Go.
Good.
This shoulder lift can be easily adapted to lifting patients into chairs. In this example, in slow motion, you'll notice these helpers prefer to clasp their hands at the base of the spine rather than flat against the patient's back. It can be difficult if the patient is unable to help himself, but even with an unconscious patient, over a short distance, it's quite suitable.
This lift can also be used to move a patient from the bed onto the floor.
This is the grip used for the kangaroo lift. Helpers grasp each other's wrists, keeping their shoulders to the front of the patient's axilla. Like so many other lifts, this one is easier if the patient is able to link arms round the helper's neck. The kangaroo lift can be used for lifting a patient into a chair or, as with the shoulder lift, onto the floor, ready to be pulled to safety on a blanket or mattress.
Although many patients will be successfully evacuated without it, equipment, particularly for immobile, unconscious, or elderly patients, should be used wherever possible. But special equipment has a habit of being mislaid or out of order in times of emergency. So don't take risks, use what you know you have. And don't forget, every ward contains a host of potential evacuation equipment, in fact, almost anything on wheels. It's vital that every nurse is familiar with the equipment in her ward. 3 minutes spent checking it now might one day save 3 lives, or perhaps even 30. You must know precisely the location of the equipment and which of your patients may need to use it. So, in an emergency, you will have to decide with a minimum amount of thinking time what is the best method, the best equipment, and the best escape route to use in the circumstances.
Evacuating patients in their beds can be one of the best methods, but it does have limitations, sheer size, for example. Before a bed can be moved, the brake must be released. Get to know the different types of bed brakes in your ward and how they work. Make sure they do work. But before moving a bed, be sure it'll fit through the door of the ward. Not just this door, but every door. Are there any obstructions on the route? Stairs, tight corners? Think before you act. If you're evacuating onto rough ground or at night, would you let this happen? One bed stuck in the mud or on a concrete step can cause no end of problems. And don't forget, the doors may be wide enough, but are they high enough? This is better. The door of the ward opens directly outside with a solid slipway that the beds can traverse. No obstructions, easy to get the beds out. But do you know what to do with them once you've got them out? Would you do this? And this? Supposing this was a real emergency with patients in those beds, your patients. One major exit from a burning hospital blocked. Several patients dumped dangerously close to a building that may collapse on them at any moment. What should they have done? You leave the beds as far away from the exit as possible. Leave them in an orderly line ready to be moved further from the danger area at the first opportunity. Don't forget, windows in burning buildings tend to collapse outwards, so park the beds with that in mind. Stretcher trolleys are useful. Remember, though, that a stretcher trolley has many of the limitations of a bed.
Nothing to worry about. We're just going to move here.
In many wards, particularly geriatric wards, there are wheelchairs and sani chairs. These are excellent for evacuation because patients, especially elderly ones, and staff are well used to them. Although 2 helpers are needed to lift a patient into a chair, only 1 is needed to wheel it to safety. Even ordinary chairs can be used. This does require 2 helpers to move it. Using an ordinary chair makes life easier if stairs are to be negotiated. An easy chair also requires 2 helpers. No, this isn't a fire alarm. It's a safe storage point for mattress lines. The mattress and line is a method of evacuation which is either good or bad, depending upon in which region you've been trained. To some, it's slow, cumbersome, and very demanding on the helpers. To its advocates, an excellent method. Certainly, without a high standard of training, it can be slow, and not all hospitals keep their mattress lines so securely that they may go missing when needed most. But because the patient is so secure, In the eyes of some, this could deny the patient any chance of self-preservation if the nurse is overcome. There's simply no escape. If the mattress and line restrict self-preservation, the patient-carrying sheet certainly does not. It's a sheet with straps which is laid on the bed springs beneath the mattress, and the bed is made up over the top. In an emergency, the straps are pulled free and secured in buckles. Perhaps a disadvantage of the carrying sheet is that bedding, if not removed first, frequently becomes jammed in the buckles. But is there time in an emergency to prevent this by removing the bedding first? Like the mattress and line method, in the hands of the right team it can be fast and effective. But can such a high standard of training be guaranteed? A patient can, if necessary, release himself from a carrying sheet. It takes one helper and a fair bit of strength to haul it to safety. An improvement on this, the evacuation mattress. The straps are permanently attached to the sides of the mattress, so there's nothing to lose and nothing to forget. A quick tug and the straps fall loose, with no buckles likely to become jammed in the bedding. All methods requiring dragging along floors are relatively simple if confined to the polished floors and staircases inside hospitals. Steps of exterior staircases are nearly always rough, so more effort will be required. So whenever it's safe to do so, it's better to use an interior staircase for the evacuation of patients. A strict rule about evacuation and stairs: always down, never up. A piece of equipment never to be used for evacuation: the lift. In case of fire, do not use the lift.
In every fire, heat and smoke develops and oxygen is used up. In the black smoke that results, it's impossible to tell what poison gases, if any, may be present. All smoke, therefore, must be regarded as dangerous. Patients and helpers must be taken out of smoke as soon as possible. Now, the heat of a fire causes the air, smoke, and gases near it to rise. So for a short time at least, there's practically always fresh air at floor level due to it being drawn into the fire.
That fresh air at floor level must be utilized in an emergency when evacuating a ward actually on fire. Not only must your patients be kept beneath smoke level, so must you. For example, if a fire threatens a nursery, get the babies onto a sheet on the floor. Then drag them out of danger 4 at a time. Same principle with adults. When things are desperate, use a blanket or mattress drag. Quick, simple, and effective. Patients receiving drip must also be got to the floor quickly.
Down.
The plastic drip can be placed under the pillow, where the weight of the patient's head will keep it working. In an emergency, patients under treatment in a balkan beam must be got onto the floor beneath smoke level. it'll be necessary to cut the extension cords, and although every care must be taken to avoid further injury, it must be remembered that broken limbs can be restored. Life can't. If there isn't time to use a blanket or sheet, lift the patient onto the floor by the shoulders and then drag the patient out of the ward.
So remember, if you are evacuating a ward which is actually on fire, the first thing you must do is to get your patients all onto the floor and then start getting them out. But if you walk into a ward and see this, or even if you just suspect that there is a fire, there is one thing you must do immediately.
In the safety of the corridor outside, the patients must be laid in the recovery position. People who have been in smoke often vomit and are then liable to asphyxiation. And as soon as possible, close the doors. At the first possible opportunity, the roll must be called.
She lived and her friends lived because the nurse who saved them knew exactly how to handle that particular emergency. She had some help, of course, but if it had been at night, she may have had to cope by herself. And one day, you might find yourself alone in an emergency. You must know what to do. Knowing what to do and doing it is really what evacuation is all about. In an emergency, your patients will depend solely on you. Their lives will be literally in your hands. So, know what to do. Don't let them nor yourself down.